Now is the time for the negative cross-examination of affirmative. Turretin fan, you have 20 minutes to cross-examine Mr. Albrecht. You may begin when you're ready.
All right. Well, thank you for debating this important topic. My first question for you is, you seemed to be suggesting at the beginning of your speech that you want to side with the early church.
That is correct.
Correct?
That is correct. Definitely, I believe that the early church, the Bride of Christ, gives a perfect example. These books have always been used as sacred scripture, with, of course, the exception of Jerome, whose position I do not believe to be tenable any longer.
Okay. Now, so you would side with Athanasius then?
Oh, absolutely, definitely. I would. I am of the persuasion that Athanasius used the Deuterocanon, and he continued to use the Deuterocanon for the rest of his life, basically. So
you're only siding with the fact that the early church used those books. So you'd also side with the Reformers?
No. Let me frame that. Let me remind you. I'm not too sure if you remember my opening statement. I'm not basing my acceptance. Well, actually, the position I'm taking is not that usage, or even quotation for that matter, equals canonical in the sense of it being sacred scripture. My argument is that these books were used by the early church, those closest to the time of Christ, as sacred scripture. Not just used, but used as sacred scripture quite frequently, very often actually.
So when Athanasius says that he doesn't accept these as part of the canon, what does that mean?
Well, I don't agree with the way that you're attempting to twist Athanasius' usage. He definitely doesn't call these books canonical, but nevertheless he says that these books teach the word of godliness. Indeed, he uses the Greek term usabias for these books, and I will concede that Athanasius doesn't call these books canonical, but as I said in my opening statement, the argument isn't on the term canon, which has varying usages. It would be on whether these books are used as sacred scripture or not. And I think if we examine Athanasius, we can see that he used these books as sacred scripture.
So you would not side with him on what's in the canon. You'd only side with him in treating these as sacred scripture, which we haven't defined.
Well, I think Athanasius, his usage of the term canon is quite different from the way I would use it, or even quite different from the way you would use it, because he's not referring to these books. He's basically not saying, all right, these books are canonical in the sense of they're the only books that are divine scripture. Otherwise, you'd have to account for the fact that, well, did Athanasius contradict himself? Because he used these books as sacred scripture quite frequently in his works. So I think if you're going to, excuse me,
I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off entirely, but I mean, he's pretty specific. He says, for the sake of accuracy, I must needs, as I write, add this: there are other books outside these which are not indeed included in the canon, but have been appointed from the time of the fathers to be read to those who are recent converts to our company and wish to be instructed in the word of true religion. These are the wisdom of Solomon, the wisdom of Sirach, Esther, Judith, and Tobit.
Correct.
Now, are you claiming that you agree with his opinion in that regard, or not?
Oh, absolutely not. I'm saying that I do agree with Athanasius in the sense that he used the Deuterocanonical books as sacred scripture. I don't agree with the terminology he uses because it's a different form of terminology. If we were to compare, let me just finish my sentence. If we were to compare his usage of the Deuterocanonical books, again, the argument isn't on how certain fathers use the term canon or not. It is whether these books are used as sacred scripture. And we can see throughout Athanasius' whole life, he used these books as sacred scripture.
Now, did you provide us with, in your speech, did you include any quotations of him using these as sacred scripture?
No, I didn't. But if you'd like, I can go ahead and do that. If you'd like, I'll open up the book here and I can read the passages.
No, that's all right. I don't want to substitute this for another constructive speech.
Sure, no problem.
You indicated in your speech as well that you viewed Akiba's comment about these things not defiling the hands, both the Christian books and these Deuterocanonical books not defiling the hands, as meaning that they're both Christian books. Is that correct? Did I understand your comment correctly?
To clarify what I was saying, my argument is that Akiba, as he is labeled the father of rabbinical Judaism, what he is doing is He's revising much of the ancient traditions of Judaism, and in doing so, he repudiates all things Christian, which is the primary reason for his Aquila text. And indeed, where he rejects the gospel of Christ, he rejects all things Christian, and he lumps the Deuterocanon right in there. I think that's a perfect example that these books were always used by the Christians. Otherwise, he would have had no reason to repudiate them.
Well, you say he repudiates ancient Judaism, but what's your evidence that there's an ancient Judaic canon that included those?
There is no strong evidence that there is an ancient Judaic canon that included these, just as there is no strong evidence that there is an ancient Judaic canon that is identical to that of Protestantism. Each of us will be in a bind if we attempt to show that. But on the other hand, if you would like, I can provide sources for you that do say indeed that Rabbi Akiva was revising ancient Judaism. If you want, I've got a whole paper on it. If you want, I could go to that.
You mentioned that the book of Sirach mentions the law, the prophets, and the other writings.
Correct.
Now, is it your position that that is not a term that meant that there's three categories of Scripture?
Well,
Old Testament Scripture?
Well, I would take the position of Lee Martin McDonald. I'm not sure if you're aware of his work, but in his work, he argues indeed that we can see in the New Testament the emerging formation of a canon, the emerging tripartite, basically, which eventually became the tripartite formation. But nevertheless, we don't have a listing of what these books are, and indeed, the formula that Protestantism likes to adopt it isn't evident in the New Testament or in any writer until much later. I would argue even.
So actually, what you just told me he said was that there was an emerging recognition of three separate categories.
I definitely do believe that there was an emerging separation into various categories. Some even used more categories than just that. My argument is not, actually my position is not that the tripartite Protestantism view on this is ancient. It isn't. It can't be found. I would argue, I would take the position of many Jews that it can't be found until even the 3rd century.
I see. The next question I have for you in the time we have left here is when it says when it lists as the third category in Luke, lists the Psalms as the third category. You suggested that people wouldn't know that there's certain books that are in that category. If
actually, let me just clarify what I was saying, just so you won't be confused. I was simply saying that I support the plain reading of the text. There's nothing that we could read into it other than it being plain and simple the Psalms. That's what my position was.
So if there was a category within the Hebrew canon, category of other writings, and the first book of that category is the Psalms, would that be, if you have that additional piece of information, that additional piece of context in which to read this, would now this actually fit with what Sirach was describing as the three categories?
Well, we would need evidence from that, from the context of the verse that you're using. If you can provide evidence for that in the context of the verse that you're using, well, it would be a lot easier to accept. But as such, I don't believe that you can provide any positive evidence for that. I mean, the plain reading is the Psalms. I mean, if you want to read into other books, a poetic device, and you can go ahead and do it, but I just don't see it.